Welcome, welcome to the Stevens College Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Program 2021. Welcome, Stevens community, residential undergraduate students, online students, graduate students. Welcome, full-time and part-time faculty. Welcome to full-time and part-time staff. Welcome, alums, and welcome to members of the Columbia, Missouri communities, and welcome to our out-of-state community members. Monday, January 18th of 2021, the college was closed to honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Many of our community members attended Zoom birthday celebration events hosted by the Columbia chapter of the NAACP and the city of Columbia, Missouri. In addition, many community members did acts of service, and some just rested. Today, we pause and gather as a community for about 60-ish minutes to listen, learn, and take action from members within and outside of our Stevens community. We encourage you to engage via the chat feature, the Q&A feature during this event. And we ask that you extend a little patience, mercy, favor, and grace for any technical transitions or challenges that we may experience as we move from speaker to speaker and grant host permissions to our program contributors. So it is my pleasure now to welcome to Zoom Speaker Spotlight, Alicia Spare. Alicia Spare contributes her time and talents as the Student Success Center Assistant Director with Stevens College. In this role, she provides academic coaching, advises first-year students, and tutors science courses. The kindness from Stevens community and the tenacity of the students she works with inspires her to be courageous in the pursuit of justice for all. So Stevens community, please use your reaction buttons or use what the ancestors gave you and welcome warmly to the Zoom Speaker Spotlight, Alicia Spare.
Thank you, Shaashawn. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We all know that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream. And in 2021, we see little Black boys and Black girls join hands with little white boys and white girls. We have seen a Black man become president of the United States of America and a woman of Black and Asian descent become vice president. Dr. King would surely be pleased to witness these events had he not been assassinated. But toward the end of his life, Dr. King broadened his views on the injustices in America. In his report to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference staff in May of 1967, Dr. King said, "We have moved from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights, an era where we are called upon to raise certain basic questions about the whole society. We have been in a reform movement, but after Selma and the Voting Rights Bill, we moved into a new era, which must be the era of revolution. We must recognize that we can't solve our problem until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. This means a revolution of values and other things. We must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together. You can't really get rid of one without getting rid of the others. The whole structure of American life must be changed. America is a hypocritical nation, and we must put our own house in order," end quote. Change happens from the bottom up, and it is our responsibility to continue the revolution Dr. King started, to ensure that every person has the right to adequate housing, healthcare, income, and education. In our communities, it has never been more important to use our resources, whether that be our vote, dollar, time, or voice, to advocate for human rights for all. Thank you again, and I know you're all going to love the program.
Thank you so much, Alicia. And Stevens community, feel free to give her the positive energy that she just gave us. And again, you can do that using your reaction buttons or placing comments in the chat or Q&A. Thank you, Alicia, for setting the tone for this gathering, for reminding us that our liberation is interwoven and entangled, and that the revolution starts in our dwellings, whether that's an apartment, a double wide, a mansion, a house, and then also our offices and our departments and the organizations where we serve. Thank you so much for your service. It is my pleasure now to introduce Mariah Lindsay. Mariah is a technical theater student pursuing a bachelor's degree in technical theater here at Stevens College. She graduates this year, so go class of 2021. Mariah is from Springfield, Missouri, and enjoys all things lighting, the presence of light, the absence of light, shadows, and the hues of light. In addition, she enjoys reading and napping. Please use your reaction buttons to welcome Mariah Lindsay.
Hello, my name is Mariah Lindsay. I created some images a year ago for the MLK event, which I'm going to share the slide now. And hopefully this works. So for the MLK event, I really wanted to create images that I used in Illustrator for our diversity event because I really wanted to focus on the idea that we are together united as we are diverse, celebrating all different types of diversity. And I really wanted to focus on how that there is still hope even in the matters of fear, and how we can still be together because we have communities like Stevens and our students and our counselors and our teachers where we can rely on one another, because I didn't want anyone to like feel alone, and that we all had a voice just like MLK. And I really use that to inspire the images and looking at other future and past images from our protest. And a lot has happened in the recent years. And I think it's best that we can rely on each other. And that's what really inspired me to create these images of having the idea of that we all have power within ourselves because we all know where we've been. And I think that's what really helps. And together, we can always dream like MLK. And that's the rest of my images. Thank you.
Stevens community, make some noise and however you're able to for those amazing visual images from Mariah Lindsay. Thank you, Mariah, for sharing those original creations of line and color and space and shape. I am confident, I know, that your creations will embellish walls and stages domestically and internationally. And thank you for your words, making sure that we're reminded of the power each of us possess as individuals and as communities and in organizations. Thank you for reminding us that there is hope within fear and that hope is greater than fear. Thank you for reminding us that we have voices, each of us a unique individual voice. And thank you for your quote. I just wrote it down. I don't want anyone to feel alone. What a beautiful source to tap into for action. So Stevens community, once again, make some noise, use your reaction buttons, put things in the chat for our very own May 2021 future graduate, Mariah Lindsay. It is now my honor to introduce to the Stevens community, Charles Overton. Charles is a Boston-based harpist and performer of classical, jazz, and world music. He began his harp studies at the age of 10 under the direction of Linnell Edger, where as a member of the American Youth Harp Ensemble, he was afforded the opportunity at an early age to perform at various venues internationally. In 2009, Charles went on to attend the Interlochen Arts Academy to further his musical development under the direction of Joan Rayburn Holland, during which Charles was a prize winner in the Young Artist Harp Competition and twice a finalist for the Interlochen Arts Academy Concerto Competition. In 2012, Charles moved to Boston to attend the Berklee College of Music, where he continues to study classical music under the direction of BSO principal harpist Jessica Zhao. He has also began to explore the world of jazz and other improvised music more seriously. During his time at Berklee, he competed in the 2013 American Harp Society National Competition, where again, he was a finalist. And he became the first trailblazer, the first harp student to be admitted to the Berklee Global Jazz Institute, a very prestigious and highly specialized program at the school in which students are able to learn from and work with intimately the master jazz artist of the contemporary time. Charles Overton has performed with various ensembles in some of the world's greatest concert halls, including Tokyo Suntory Hall, the Stern Auditorium at Carnegie Hall, the Berlin Philharmonic, Boston Symphony Hall, and the KKL Luzerne Concert Hall. Stevens community, please give a warm welcome to the Charles Overton.
Thank you for that very, very warm welcome. And it's my pleasure to be here with you all today, Stevens community, as we celebrate the life and work of the great, Martin Luther King. So I'll be presenting 3 selections this afternoon for you all. The first is a tune by the legendary jazz pianist Keith Jarrett entitled Country. Though I think MLK would be happy to see the world that we live in today and how far we've come. As Alicia said, we still have plenty of work to do, and I think we can only do that work united as a country. Second is an old show tune called My Favorite Things. And I think it's just, this song has such a great message talking about when times are hard, times are difficult, that we always turn to the things that we love, the things that we cherish, to give us strength, hope, and the energy to go on. And then last, just as I think has been a common theme today here, I think the only thing that can combat the fears that we all have that make us as a country, as humanity, behave so awfully is hope. Hope and love are the things that will carry us forward. And this last tune will be a tune called Hope by Ed Sandin, one of my first ever professors at the Berklee College of Music. So again, we have Country by Keith Jarrett, My Favorite Things, and then Hope. Hope you enjoy. Thank you again, Stevens community, for having me here today in this celebration of the life and work of Martin Luther King. I couldn't be happier to do my part in paying homage to this incredible man and his great legacy. Thank you once again.
Charles Overton, my. Thank you so much for continuing to be ear and eye inspiration. This was my second opportunity to experience you. And King, you are magnificent. We celebrate and honor your perfect practice, perfect practice, and more practice. We honor your hands, we honor your study, and we honor your presence. What a magnificent example of taking up space on the earth and then also giving back to it. So Charles, thank you so much for sharing your gifts with us. And Stevens community, Charles is going to stay around to answer questions that you may have during the question and answer period. So again, make some noise as you're able for Charles Overton. And thank you, Lita Pistono, who is our Zoom guru, for reminding me that in this version of Zoom webinar, there aren't the reaction buttons or the chat feature. So I apologize as the host. Definitely charge it to my head and not my heart. But that's also a lesson, right? That you can give praise and celebration in whatever space you are gracing, whether the rest of the community sees it or not. So hopefully you are using what the ancestors gave you to clap and snap and and aha. I know every time I get to experience Charles, it makes me go to my emotional wheel and actually name all the emotions that I feel, because I want to cry and I want to rejoice and everything in between. So again, thank you very much, Charles Overton. So speaking of, he played favorite things, he's becoming one of my favorite people. It is absolutely my honor to introduce you to one of my favorite human beings. Julia Mallory is a poet, a children's book author. Here's one book, Black Mermaids. One of the children's books, Karima. Breathe. And those are just from my private collection, but she's a 6-time author, and she's the founder of creative literary arts brand, Black Mermaids. She serves as the senior poetry editor for Raising Mothers and hosts the Stop Shrinking Social Cast. Her latest book, Survivor's Guilt, takes an unflinching look at grief. Julia has earned a Bachelor of Science from Elizabethtown College and completed her graduate studies at Eastern University. She is the mother of 3 children. She lives in Central Pennsylvania. So please send her all the positive energy and thoughts. Take a beautiful deep inhale and exhale and welcome a woman who is bold, a woman who is brave, a woman who is resilient, a woman who is Black excellence, Black creativity, and a word massager, my sister spirit creative, and so much more. Julia Mallory, as she delivers her facilitation of Dreaming of the Now Future, a Reckoning. Stevens community, please welcome Julia Mallory.
Whew. To live up to that amazing introduction. Thank you so much, Professor Dial, for having me. I want to extend so much love and gratitude to the Stevens community, guests and folks that are joining in, and also just another adding my praise as well to Charles's performance, an amazing harpist, and it just really just lifts your spirit and just gets it just gets into your nerve endings, and just amazing work. So I just want to just acknowledge that as well. And thank you to all of the folks and staff who are helping to put this all together, and who have gone before us to set the stage. So I am super excited to be here today to talk to you about kind of where I see things at where we're at now, and realizing the promise of Dr. King's dream. And then I know like it's so common for us to be like, hey, here's the things that Dr. King wanted, and we have so far to go. And I don't want to gloss past that so far to go, because I think when we look at really, as I think even Alicia had said, where Dr. King was talking about, this recognizing the role that social justice and a lack of equal opportunity and economic justice and militarism, the role that those play in our society and the impact, and even I think political reckoning as well. And we're still in the throes of, widespread disenfranchisement of certain voters. And so I wanted to acknowledge those remarks, and I would be remiss if I didn't, but I'm going to go ahead and obviously I've prepared a keynote, and we'll probably do a little riffing as AKA freestyling as the mood permits. But my speech or keynote today is called Dreaming of a Now Future, A Reckoning. And so just a little bit about that title. Again, we know Dr. King had such a great vision for what he wanted for America and her citizens. And we know the stark contrast to what everything he was fighting for, right, in relationship and community with people, and then the reality of what that actually looked like. And so, but we need our dreams, right? We need our dreams. We need not just the ability to say, hey, this world is an awful place and it's difficult, but what is the world that we want to build? And I think that is one of the reasons why so many people were attracted to Dr. King, because he was also saying, like, this is what I'm seeing for us in the future, right? This is the hope that I have, and I'm trying to manifest that hope by actually moving towards direct action to be able to bring about this change that we want. And the now future part of my title comes from a poem from Audre Lorde called A Litany for Survival. And just this very quick excerpt from it that says, seeking a noun that can breed futures like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the depth of ours. And so I'm going to talk a little bit too about what it means, right? Like, we're in this now, but we're also working towards a future. And I'm thinking about someone like Dr. King, who one of the things he said in one of his speeches is Dr. King said, I may not get there with you, right? And so he was already foreshadowing, or I don't want to say foreshadowing, but really acknowledging that all the hate and all the systems and folks that were invested in his demise. And so what does it look like for us to say, hey, we want to make this, we want to breathe air now, right? Like, we want healthy airways and clear waterways. Like, we want to be able to survive this world so that we can then also make sure that there is a world for future generations to inhabit. So that is some of my connection and passion to that Audre Lorde excerpt. So just a little bit about my own personal relationship to the teachings of Dr. King. When I was a kid, I was always struck by, obviously Dr. King is a cultural giant. And so I was just always struck by this man who was absolutely, in some senses, we would say larger than life. But Dr. King also seemed to have this genuine love for this country, right? Just his hopefulness, his optimism, as well as this country's people, and the belief that they would eventually do the right thing. And I think also just his unwavering commitment to Black folks as well. And it strikes me, I feel like it took me years later to realize, as an older teen, because I feel like the failure of my schooling it always seemed like we were supposed to kind of either you were like Team King, like you were riding with Dr. King in the dream, or you were like, oh, I'm not a person, I'm not a King follower, right? I'm more Malcolm X, or I'm more supposedly some other seemingly more radical Black person or Black group. And then as an older teen, when I started doing my own research and realizing that, oh my goodness, I've just been given such a sanitized version of Dr. King, and that the same people that are now, seeming to really love Dr. King and all the things that he represented, they really only loved him, and they could really only love a man like King in retrospect. That it's easier to love someone, right, in retrospect, because you can then say, oh, well, you're no King, right? So there we could say, hey, Dr. King and his ideas, we really loved him. And so if you can't exemplify that or replicate that, then there's no space for your type of activism. And another thing I think I've always was struck by is how there's always so much talk about love and love and love. But yeah, I remember just feeling like the hate and the violence that killed Dr. King, and how all those systems were intertwined to make that reality happen, were just pretty much hidden. And so we talk about love, but the thing that we cannot forget about love is more than just a feeling, right? Love is a commitment. And so when folks say, when we believe that we're in love with the idea of freedom and liberty and justice for folks, it's not just about how we feel, but it's about what are we actually committed to, right? Like, how are we making that now future possible? And so it just makes me think about how sometimes people believe in hindsight that they might have marched with someone like Dr. King, but find it very difficult to march now. And I'm not absolutely not privileging one form of activism over the other, because there's so much work for us to do, that whether you're a person that writes letters, whether you're a person that educates people on the internet, whether you're a person that that does come and do, direct action outside of, your congressperson's office, there's more than one way to be able to impact change here. So one of the things, and I believe Alicia, referenced this in her remarks when we talk about economic inequality. So Dr. King, that reality was not lost on him. And I believe, and I'm calling it economic captivity in a sense. And so as an older, teen, and reading the I Have a Dream speech for myself, I'm like, oh my goodness, there is so much, like everybody kind of knows what I call to be the colorblind utopia part of it, about his children being able to be with children that, with white children and that sort of thing. But early on in that speech, the March on Washington, delivered in the summer, the August of 1963, one of the things that Dr. King, he is calling for a reckoning throughout that entire speech. But in the very beginning, Dr. King says, in a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, Black men as well as white men, will be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. And so me reading that as the adult that I am now, and looking more, a closer examination of that. So a couple things. One, we know that the expression all men, right, is not gender or racially inclusive at the time of the formation of those documents, right? And there was ultimately, if we're honest, and I believe part of that optimism, Dr. King wanting to hold folks accountable with the idea. But if we're honest, we know there was literally no promissory note issued to non-white men in this country. If we reckon with the reality that that check wasn't just returned for insufficient funds, as Dr. King says in his speech, but it basically was an account that we never had access to. And so ultimately what has been happening, it feels like we've been moving from decade to decade and not acknowledging that the American dream, as seductive as it has been, right, it is built in the production of nightmares for folks who are not included in that original Declaration of Independence. And so how does that, to use the words of Audre Lorde, how do their dreams, right, reflect the death of ours? And so as a Black woman born in America, the descendants of enslaved Africans on this soil, I know that I have, personal experience with that reality. So on one hand, wanting to believe in the promise and the potential, right, of this country, but just believing in the promise of the potential of it doesn't make it so. And so I have a quick clip that I want to play for you because this clip is from 5 years later. So I believe earlier in the clip, Dr. King is absolutely talking about economic justice, but I believe he still is kind of using, we've come to cash a check, almost in a metaphorical sense, right? But I think when we see his work evolve over time with his work for the Poor People's Campaign, when he became very clear about the economic captivity that people were experiencing, this clip delivered in 1968, also the year that Dr. King was assassinated. And so we also know that Dr. King was in Memphis to show his support for sanitation workers that were on strike. And so I think all those details, the timing of it all, like it all makes sense. So I think it's very different when you just say, hey, America's, what are we going to do about this race issue? And then it only comes down to, can folks ride on the front of the bus, or, what are these issues that we have around voting? But I think when it becomes to be crystallized, and Dr. King makes it very, very clear, the relationship that economic inequality is playing in all these systems, then I think it even makes him a much larger threat, as folks smarter than me have already basically detailed throughout the years. So I'm going to play this really quick clip, and I'm just going to bring up, just in case, if you can't hear me, please let me know, Shaashawn.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today, many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. This is what we are faced with, and this is a reality. Now, when we come to Washington, in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
So in that clip, the campaign, again, that Dr. King is referencing, right? He's talking about the Poor People's Campaign, and he makes it very clear, right? It's not like metaphorical here. He's telling you all the ways in which systems have participated in ultimately white uplift and have basically bequeathed all these things to certain white folks throughout the country without including the same type of economic support for other groups. And if we dig deeper into this clip, right, we know that there's so much when we're talking about land, right? Like this, we know all of this land is stolen, and it's, it's so messy in terms of what are the resources and the things that have basically been redistributed to folks who originally they did not belong to. So when Dr. King at that end, when he is saying, we are coming to get our check, he's literally talking about, what are these opportunities for economic justice that exist? So speaking of, I guess these remarks almost couldn't be timed any better, because when we talk about going to the nation's capital, I'm going to shift a little bit here in my remarks. When we're talking about going to the nation's capital, the reckoning that Dr. King was talking about versus the one, people going to the nation's capital a few weeks ago, right? With their grievances. And we can even see the stark contrast to how their actions are discussed in the mainstream press, and even how these systems seem to have a place for what we would call white grievance or a space for white rage. And so I'm going to quote Professor Juliet Hooker, who has produced work around political loss and what we would call white grievance and Black grief. And so in this very she says, in the US during Obama and Trump eras, the two most important forces driving racial politics in the US are Black grief and white grievance. Black grief is exemplified by the Black Lives Matter protests against police violence, which continues a long tradition of Black political mobilization, catalyzed by Black death as a result of white violence that is subsequently channeled into public mourning. Simultaneously, Trump's presidency brought about long simmering cries of white victimhood and have crystallized into a potent politics of white grievance that frames the US a white country under siege. And so the interesting thing about this, Professor Hooker, I believe, started writing on this topic in like 2017. And then she gave a keynote, I believe at Brown University in February 2019. This particular excerpt is from February 2019. So I can only imagine, right? Like this was not foreshadowed in terms of, like, you could just see the writing was on the wall, right? So even folks going to storming the Capitol, like, that was not by accident, right? This has been the accumulation of all of the half-truths and misinformation and all of those things that have been put out into the public. And so there was a tweet that was shared about a week after the storming of the Capitol from Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis, who said, "I'm so damn tired of living in a country that treats Black grief as a threat and white rage as a sacrament." And so when I'm thinking about Black grief, I'm thinking about, so Dr. King was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. And so the owner, the co-owner, Lori Bailey, who co-owned the motel with her husband, upon hearing the news of Dr. King's assassination at her motel, she suffered a stroke. She never regained consciousness and she died a few days later. And so I'm thinking about, even again, to Professor Hooker's point about white grievance, right? We know how Dr. King was assassinated, but then we also know, Dr. King had been trailed for years by the FBI. Dr. King had been a target of their efforts to prevent what they call basically the rise of a Black Messiah. And so we know all the intricacies at play that made the murder of someone like Dr. King possible, and the impact that had on a Black woman like Lori Bailey. And in addition to that, also thinking about, the Lorraine Motel being kind of this institution, because at a time when Black folks could not stay, right, in certain places, and you had an institution like the Lorraine Motel that provided that type of service. And I went to Memphis in 2015, and I was really struck by, because as a child, when I saw those pictures of the motel, it just seemed larger than life, and maybe because the people in the pictures were larger than life, so to speak. But then going there in person and seeing it and just being struck by, like, wow, it's like, almost just a half a block. It's not that large. But out front of there, there's also a plaque that quotes a Bible verse. And I should have wrote the verse down, but the verse is basically, it's referencing, it says, lo and behold, here is a dreamer. Come, let us slay him and let's find out what will happen of his dreams. And that is basically, the quote is about Joseph and the jealousy of his brothers, that basically, Joseph was, he was highly favored, and he had this amazing robe, and his brothers were jealous of him. And so ultimately they were trying to conceive a plan to kill him. And so it makes me think about also, again, what is our responsibility? Again, not to just love Dr. King in retrospect, right? Not to just know that we have so much work to do, but what is our world, like, what is our role in building that now future that Dr. King, did not get a chance to see, did not get a chance to experience. So thinking about back to the Capitol, the rage at the Capitol, when we talk about these systems and how they are harmful and perpetuating this pervasive harm, I'm thinking of the woman that is accused of stealing Representative Pelosi's laptop. And that person is actually from the county that I live in, where she also, I believe, lives. And so I'm thinking about how quickly she was processed through the system and released at a prison that I spent, so many years visiting loved ones from, that have done absolutely less. And not that I'm calling for a larger incarceration of any people, right? But thinking about, I have a friend who shared on social media at the same exact time that her brother had been incarcerated in Dauphin County Prison for 5 months over a paperwork error. And just thinking about how there's ultimately these systems, how we like to think that these systems are somehow broken, but as many people know, these systems aren't really broken. They are functioning as they were designed to, right? So we're thinking about who, the way these systems are designed to harm and who benefits from these systems when they are functioning as intended. I'm thinking of the prison abolitionist, Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who instructs on the ways that incarceration rises when we have surplus labor. So ultimately, right, when there are more people that need jobs than we have, how you will see a rise in incarceration, because it's ultimately like, what do you do with all these people? And I'm thinking about my state, Pennsylvania in particular, who received $175 million, y'all, in CARES Act funding to be able to provide rent and mortgage assistance. And what we found out, this article released kind of, after it already happened, we found out that the state absolutely failed to spend $108 million because the rules were so difficult for people to access it. So instead of being more liberal and saying, hey, we know it's a pandemic in this world and folks are experiencing all types of difficulty, we basically saw the restrictive nature of being able to help the people that need it the most. And do you want to guess where that $108 million was reallocated to? The $108 million has been reallocated to our Department of Corrections. And so something about that just blows my mind. The idea that funds that were meant to prevent putting people in situations that make it difficult for them to care for themselves and their families, that we wouldn't figure out a more creative way, right, to allocate the funds. We would say on the back end, hey, the Department of Corrections seems like an appropriate place to spend $108 million in a state who has actively been working to reduce its prison population. So it doesn't make sense, especially in this time, like I said, when we think about in the pandemic, like the racial and gender wage gap absolutely still persists. So I'm remembering at the beginning of pandemic, like how even now, we're still praising essential workers, but without really ensuring their safety or any sort of benefits such as hazard pay. I'm thinking about how originally, remember how there were all these calls for unity and how like, we're all in this together and we're gonna get through this. And then in the next breath, how quickly it shifted when we realized that some of the higher rates of death were among Black and Hispanic people. And then suddenly we had our then Surgeon General on TV basically, and it's a quote, it's not even basically, telling us that we needed to be more responsible so that we could protect our big daddies and our abuelas. So that type of messaging is not by accident, especially in a world where only 1 in 5 Black people have jobs that they cannot do from home, right? Some of us are very fortunate that we have an opportunity to work from home. I can deliver this from the comfort of my living room. But when we say essential workers, right, we can't forget those are folks who are absolutely on the front lines. And so we would, our then Surgeon General would talk down to folks who are harmed by these systems while also actively ignoring the pervasive reality of medical racism. So what do we do, right, when the harm is built into these systems that are self-perpetuating and thriving in spite of the actions of well-meaning people, right? So some of the thing that I feel like we continuously do is we have to remember that reckoning, right? Reckoning requires that we stop rushing people that are harmed by others in these systems from what I call from grief to gratitude. It's always this idea that, oh, it could be worse, or that you should be grateful for what you do have. And without really acknowledging. So Dr. King talked about in his 1963 speech, also chided what we call gradualism, right? He's also like, people say, oh, it's not time yet, or these things take time. And I think that even then, Dr. King said that like the time is now, right? And so when we talk about the now future, like if we can't make a difference right now, and if we can't start to work towards the progress that we know is going to make our lives and this world a better place, then when will we start? So reckoning is also not gradualism, right? Reckoning is a series of deliberate, it seeks to acknowledge the harm that has happened, it seeks to repair it, and then it seeks to prevent it, right? So first we have to say like, ouch, this thing has happened, right? And then we say, how can we fix it? What does it look like? That's why we saw over the last couple of years, this massive movement to remove these monuments of people who have terrorized, whether indigenous, like everyone from indigenous folks, in between, because we're saying this is a constant reminder. It's a constant reminder of the harm that is happening. I think about even my 5th grade son, and I'm thinking about, we had an exercise, well, not we, he had homework to do, a research project, and it was supposed to be kind of looking at, I guess, innovation and people who are responsible for some discoveries in this country. And in the process of doing the research, he could clearly see that every person that was listed there had ultimately been what we would call a colonizer, right? And so a complete disregard for the lives that already existed before they showed up. And then the need and the want and the desire to absolutely control those folks and eradicate them if they could not be used for their labor, if they could not be brought under their submission. So reckoning is deliberate, right? It seeks to acknowledge the harm, to repair it, to prevent it. And I feel like sometimes America is basically stuck on this time travel loop where we maybe get to acknowledgement at best, like, oh, this is so bad. That is so bad. We're so sorry that happened. Black Lives Matter, read this book, go to this training. But what do we do after we've read all the books, right? What do we do? Because I think education is absolutely important, right? It's not just a matter of the education though, because knowledge alone is not power, but it's what we do with that knowledge, right? To make the power and the actualization of what we're trying to accomplish real. So what do we do after we've read all the books, right? What does it look like to reckon with those realities in your own corner of the world. I think, again, as I mentioned earlier in my remarks, the world, there's so much work to be done, right? There's so much work to be done. What's the thing that feels like your work? What's the thing that makes you feel like this is the thing I can do in the now future to help reckon with the things that have happened in the past? What does your work look like in relationship to the world that we're all trying to build? So Dr. King said, and I'm wrapping up here, y'all. Dr. King said, let freedom ring. Like his I Have a Dream speech, he is mentioning the idea of letting freedom ring throughout this land. He mentions it so many times, y'all. But we know how bells work. Like, it's just not going to sound itself, right? It's just not one day that the bell of freedom is just going to erupt out of, out of the earth and suddenly grant us full freedom. It makes me, even mentioning a bell, it makes me think of the Liberty Bell. So the Liberty Bell actively existing in a central part of the city of Philadelphia while slavery was still absolutely in practice. And so we know that the Bell of Freedom by itself, right, is not a substitute. So what now future will we shape? The question is, right, what now future will we shape with our hands on freedom's bell? And so I thank you for your time. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you, and I look forward to answering any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you.
Stevens community, wherever you are, whether you're in movement or you're still, make some noise, move what the ancestor gave you, send some energy, some intentional light breath towards Julia Mallory for that keynote. Thank you, queen, poet, word massager, thinker, critical thinker. So you know I was taking notes. You know what I do.
Of course,
So I appreciate you encouraging us to resist the sanitized version of Dr. Martin Luther King, because it's easy to love him in retrospect, as you said. The question you posed to us was, would we have loved him in the moment when he was at his height of being an activist, a challenger, an unapologetic lover of his people? Thank you, Julia Mallory, for reminding us that love is a commitment. It's an action towards liberty, justice, and liberation. And thank you, Julia Mallory, for reminding us of our actions, that we can write letters, we can educate online, we can do direct action, be that marching or making sandwiches for the people who marched, in the words of Jan Kell Adams. We appreciate that. Thank you, Julia, for making us question, whom are we granting access to? Whom are we granting access to? Thank you for telling us that just believing doesn't make it so. Thank you for having us question, how can we redistribute resources? Thank you for naming the creative who put that tweet on Twitter about the exploration of white grievance and the exploration of Black grief and the relationship between those two. Thank you, Julia Mallory, for asking us, what is our role in building a now future? And for reminding us that harm is built into systems, so they really aren't broken. The systems are working and designed not for people of color. So what do we do knowing that? Thank you for making us question, are we making it easier or more difficult for individuals and families and communities to get what they need? And thank you for continuing to challenge us to critically think about this ongoing pandemic and how it is disproportionately impacting certain individuals and communities. Thank you for making us question, what are we going to do with the knowledge we gain? And what is our work in the now future? Because a bell doesn't sound itself, says Julia Mallory. So thank you for leaving us with the question, what now future will you shape? What now future will you shape? Stevens community, give another round of applause, snaps, claps. I want to thank Courtney, Sadie, Dr. Nunley, Laura Ewing, Steph B, Sunny, Nadine, Devin, and Felicia, just a few of the folks who have put comments and love, affection, and questions in the Q&A. Thank you for remaining engaged. So I want to invite Charles Overton to please unmute his video if he's willing. And there's at least 2 questions. I'll check the chat in a moment. And so I want to pose these to each of you as Black creatives, as Black studiers. Each of you study your crafts, whether that's publishing, writing, poetry, children's books with Julia. The first time I saw stats about the low number of children's books with Black characters was a tweet from Julia Mallory. Charles Overton is the first harpist that I say I know and can email and speed dial and text, right? So how are we connecting Black creatives and thinkers and scholars and doers to each other and to larger communities? But the first question that was placed in the Q&A, thank you for the question asker, was how can we do a better job of portraying a unsanitized version of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? What about his voice do you think has been lost through his sanitation that needs to be emphasized more?
I think this is one for Julia, maybe. Well, I want to first start off just by saying, first of all, thank you so much for your extremely insightful comments. I know for me, I myself haven't done my due diligence, my due research, my due groundwork for fully understanding the breadth and nature of Dr. King's work and his legacy. So thank you for giving me an education today, to helping me understand, and with such just the finger right on the pulse. Really just so thought-provoking for me, and thank you very much. Excuse me, thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you, everyone, and for the questions. So I think, what can we do? How can we do a better job of portraying it? And forgive me, this sounds flippant. I think portraying it, right? Like, I think part of it is doing that education, and just looking a little closer, because I think a lot of times we kind of come in contact with commonly used information that's put out into the public. And sometimes we just have to be like, what else is on the other side of this, right? Like, maybe just, instead of just, if you see a speech excerpt, maybe just reading the whole speech, because sometimes we forget that a lot of these systems are not going to give us the tools that we need to dismantle it. So it's like, it's easy. We're in a era of like mass consumption of content. But I think, with that being said, sometimes it's easy to just kind of get caught on just what's right in front of us. So Dr. King, I think, really familiarizing ourselves with his work. And the other question, part of it says, what about his voice, who I think has been lost? I think what has been lost has absolutely been his understanding of the intersections of what we talk about, economic justice and militarism, and the political system. So I think that part, we talk about, we know the dream. Let me say this. What we can do is not assume that we know his dream until we actually read what he is saying. And so, he's talking, before his death, like, he's talking about the Vietnam War, right? He's talking about, money. He's talking about dollars, right? He literally says, we are coming to get our check. And so I think, succinctly put, what has been lost, I think his understanding of the layers of harm happening under the name of the American Empire have been lost.
Thank you. The second question that was in there is, what do you think are most important steps we need to take in order to improve the justice system? How do people outside of the system advocate for reform in an effective way? And what do you think about Biden's recent order to phase out private prisons? So kind of 3 in there, you can just pluck out one or speak to all of it.
Whew. So there's so many layers here when we talk about the justice system, because at what point of entry, right? We have so many people that are kind of under the carceral system. They might not necessarily be in prisons, but they might be what we call on paper in some sort of way, right? They might have some sort of probation sentence or some type of parole sentence. And so I think when we, there's the justice system, there are so many layers. So forgive me if I don't have like a fast answer, but I think everything, I can't emphasize it enough. Like everything starts with knowing for yourself what exactly is happening in these places. And when we look at sentencing guidelines and how some people are harmed, we have kind of sometimes this idea of punishment, but is that really changing anything? And then we also have in this country, so if you ever watched the documentary, The 13th, that Ava DuVernay produced, where they're talking about how the 13th Amendment basically, abolishes slavery, but except for folks that are kind of under some type of carceral sentence. And so what that means too is that slavery in this country, a lot of folks believe it hasn't really ended, that it just shifted. And so we have, again, as Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore says about the rise of surplus labor. And then like, I imagine like, there's a part of, if you look at kind of the trace of how even at one point, we had crime rates that were going down, but incarceration was rising. So I think a lot of times this is stuff that takes a minute to get familiar with. And so I don't imagine that probably the average person is just going to like want to know all this information. So maybe it is definitely just picking like, hey, where's somewhere I can start? And listening to the people who are doing the work. Like I follow, folks that, this is their advocacy and their activism. And sometimes some of the things that they say make me uncomfortable, right? I've never considered it. So I think the biggest thing for change too is being okay to, you got to sit with your discomfort, because what's going to happen is you're going to hear information sometimes for the first time and it's going to shock you. And then also when you look at even your role and maybe being complicit in it, it's just like, and intentionally and unintentionally. So sometimes it is a matter of just being okay with that discomfort when we see the information and not wanting to disregard it just because it doesn't fit into maybe what we've been taught. And so part of, these systems are, it's really important for these systems to do what they do for us to kind of dehumanize people. So these systems have to kind of create like Black criminality or Black pathology or like, immigrants taking your jobs. Like we need kind of all this messaging around like the harm that these people supposedly cause so that we can ignore the ways in which people are harmed by these systems. So I think the biggest thing, if you are outside of the system and you want to advocate, there's so many layers. It could be really just educating yourself and the people around you. So enough. So when somebody says something crazy or that's wrong, you could be like, first of all, like, actually it's X, Y, and Z, right? You can educate the people that are close to you. And also some other things like activists, they need financial support. So maybe you're like, hey, I got extra $25. I'm gonna send it to this particular activist, right? Some direct giving, not just writing a check maybe to a big organization, but like literally, hitting the cash app of someone that is on the front lines or doing the work, just saying thank you. Writing letters, right? Like that type of stuff does matter. Letting even where you're at politically, letting politicians know that you're paying attention, because they're just invested on us sleepwalking and doing so many other things. And I'm definitely not talking down to anyone, because as a regular, I consider myself a regular person. It can be overwhelming at times, right? And that's why I think it's just okay to be like, hey, this is my little, this is my little garden over here. This is where I sow my seeds. And this is where I'm trying to bring a harvest. Because if you look at it so big and so many issues, I think it can overwhelm even the most radical person. And then the last thing here says, what do you think of Joe Biden's recent order to phase out private prisons? So I was looking, if you saw me looking down, I was trying to find this quote. because a prison abolitionist that I follow on social media, on Twitter, actually posted a quote from Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore from 2015 that talks about how little investment is actually being done at the federal level into private prisons. And so what that means is that if it's a start, then that's awesome. It's a start, right? Like, okay, we're gonna phase out private prisons, and that makes a whole lot of sense, right? But if that is the start and the end, it's not sufficient. So even like a lot of states, some states don't even, they don't have, some states don't really use private prisons, but they might have contracts with private consultants or private industry to be able to come in and provide like medical care or food service. So if we just say private prison, but without looking at the intersection of private industry within prisons, like it's not going to be sufficient to make a change. And I just said, again, in my state, we have a black man who is the head of corrections, who I first interacted with his work. I used to run a mental health organization. And so he was really huge about trying to understand all the layers at play, and making sure folks had, and the system is nowhere near, like, it's not like a good thing or a good place or anything like that. But I say that to say he absolutely is committed to reducing the prison population in our state. And so there are legislators, y'all, who have absolutely fought him on this, who have basically said, well, what are we supposed to do for jobs? Right? Like when you talk about closing a prison, you talk about you are affecting the industry that exists in a prison town, right? So this is why I'm saying, like, these systems are like the way they perpetuate harm, and how, like, if you live in Lititz County, and actually that's not a county. If you live in a place, I'm sorry, I'm thinking Luzerne, you live in Luzerne County and there's a private prison there, you're not like, hey, yes, abolish prisons, because you don't have to tell your constituents they should pull themselves up by their bootstraps and figure out other jobs, right? They have jobs now. And so when we look at just the intersection of how these things are at play, it doesn't lend itself to doing the thing that humanizes people. So I'm saying all that to say, if the private prisons is a start, how does it trickle down to the states? Because I just told y'all that even in our state, where they are reducing prison population, there was $108 million infused into that system that did not go to people that are not incarcerated to prevent, folks don't have housing. What happens? Like, all types of things happen. And then now we have other people who are criminalized because they lack resources. And now there's a system that just got $108 million, even though it was actively working to reduce its prison population. So if the phase out informs states saying, hey, we need to look closer at this, that makes sense. But if it's just got that out the way, it's not going to be sufficient. It's not going to do anything.
Awesome. Thank you, Julia. Charles.
Questions don't lend themselves to fast answers.
No, not at all. Look, complicated challenges have complicated solutions. So it's all good. Charles, in the chat or in the Q&A, someone asked, it's a two-parter, what sparked your relationship? So what sparked the relationship between you and the harp? And the second part was, what was your experience as a person of color early in your musical development?
Sure. So just to talk a little bit about what sparked my relationship with the harp and music, I think first and foremost, it's just my family. Although they're not musicians themselves, my parents thought from a very young age that I needed to have some kind of relationship with music in my life. They had me in what they called, like, maybe these still are going around, but kinder music, just like basically mommy and me sort of, music classes for my little 1-2-year-old self. And then I actually had a violin in my hands when I was 3 or something like that, just a 16th size violin. It looks like a little toy. But I don't know how many of you are violinists or have children who play violin. But when you're that little and you're just starting, you sound bad. Very, very bad. And I think even then I had little sensitive ears and I just did not want to touch the thing because I was so terrible at it. I was just so awful, and just that squeaky that's it's no good. So anyway, fast forward a couple years, the general music teacher at my elementary school was also a harpist, and she just came up to me one day and said, "Go home, tell your mom that you want to play the harp." And I had no idea what a harp was. I was not familiar with this instrument, but I do what I'm told. So I went home and I told my mom, "Hey, I've got to try out this instrument," the teacher lady said. And anyway, after a trial lesson at the instrument, I was just mesmerized, because even as a beginner, just there's so not anything that you can do. Well, I've discovered that now there is, but it's very difficult to make this instrument sound anything but very pleasing to the ears. And I think for me, and knowing that my heart wanted something to do with music, this was the gateway that I needed to get into what I felt even then was like my life's, dream or mission or goal. And I think that still persists to this day, not so much in the sort of cheap way of like, oh yeah, it just sounds pretty, but I found such beauty and love in just the connection between self and the instrument. Like, unlike violin, where you have the bow that's making contact with the string, which then vibrates, or brass instruments where you have a mouthpiece, or wind instruments where you have a mouthpiece, or piano where you have the keys and the hammers. With the harp, it's you and the strings. It's direct contact, and for better or for worse, the sound that you encourage and get out of the instrument is you. It is you in its, I guess, purest sense, and I think that's so just beautiful. And of course, there's always the history of the instrument and how every ancient culture had a version of the instrument. Like in West Africa, there was the kora. The plucked string is just something that runs deep. I always, maybe this isn't true, maybe I need to do more research, but I always think in music, there's the voice, there's the drum, and there's the harp. Like, those are the three sort of kind of character, different expressions of musical creation in any society. So I think just being so in touch with something so pure, so ancient, so I think it's incredible. And then I guess being a person of color, a Black person in coming up, especially in classical music communities, it's been interesting, honestly, because I think I was very privileged, honestly, to have both parents who I don't know, just my community was not one that ever drew attention to the fact that I was any different than anyone else. And it took me until moving out on my own to college up here in Boston to really come face to face with anything like, oh, I look different, I am something that you do not see often doing this. So I thank my communities that I was a part of, that I wasn't made to feel ostracized or othered in any way for so much of my life. But then, coming up to Boston, it was kind of this twofold thing. In classical music, I was finding that I was this sort of unicorn or this other thing. I was part of this organization called the Boston Philharmonic Youth Orchestra. And anyway, it was an 21 and under orchestra made up of all the greatest college students from like New England Conservatory, all these prestigious places. And Berklee, although it's an incredible musical institution, it's not necessarily recognized for its achievements in Western classical music. So here I was, a Black man playing the harp from Berklee in this organization, and I felt like, wow, for the first time in my life, I feel really, really just like nothing in a way, which was really low. But at the same time, in going to Berklee, I was finding myself more deeply connected to my roots, my musicological roots. I was exploring jazz, R&B, at times hip hop. And I was really getting into what it meant to be, like, I guess, the Black music tradition in America, and discovering that all American music, even classical American music, is Black music. It's built by our people, and just to find that connection with that was something that was truly inspiring. and it still inspires me today. So yeah, I hope that answers those questions.
Thank you, Charles. So I want you two to start thinking about any kind of lasting thoughts, words, charges, call to actions that you want to give our Stevens community. And then I will ask the last question that was put in the chat because I want to honor the person who took the effort to do that. And they wrote in there, how do we hold PWIs, which is predominantly white institutions, and non-BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, and those subconsciously promote institutionalized isms accountable for only addressing the dream on King's birthday versus everyday responsible business and personal development. So this piece of, I think what they are getting at that I think, many folks have experienced is kind of from January 18th until February 28th, you're the stuff, and then you're forgotten about after that. So, what are your thoughts, charges, call to actions around that?
That's funny because I feel like, it couple things. One, even if we go back to just the part of the speech that people always like to say about how King wanted his kid could be, hand in hand with the white kid, or, I'm sorry, I'm grossly paraphrasing, but like Dr. King didn't say, I only want that to happen on a holiday or a certain day, or, right? It was like consistently. And so I think part of it is these, like our institutions, like making sure that they're familiar with the dream is, right? And I know how easy it is, especially when you're like, even in organizations that are supposed to be doing good, like academic institutions and nonprofits, I feel like because people were invested in doing this good work, that they forget about the means and the methods that they're doing it. So I think some of the accountability really just looks like reminding these institutions about what King's dream really was. And then if we're being really tangible, right, like what are the plans for equity and diversity? Like, what do they look like? Because that would mean that, hey, it's another opportunity. Let's say it's an opportunity to talk about engineering, right? In June, can you find a Black engineer person, y'all, I'm an artist, a Black engineer person? Can you find a Black engineer that can come and talk about engineering, right? Like not just booking Black folks to talk during Black History Month, right? Like not just, booking Indigenous folks to come and talk about, just things that are just specific to cultural or racial references, which are important because there's a lot of misinformation, and I would rather trust it in the mouth of the lived experience of a person. But what about all those other things? How do we normalize the presence of non-white folks outside of places of harm and trauma? I think is also a huge part of it.
Yeah, sort of just piggybacking off of what Julia said. I think the main thing to hold close is I'm a really goal oriented person. So just really to sit with yourself and the leaders of these institutions, and if you're a person at these institutions, really what is the goal of these, as we have seen so often these days, DEI initiatives? What is the real goal? Is it to check a box so that your organization can have said, we did this, check it out? Or is it to really take a good look and how is my organization taking an active role in bettering the lives of BIPOC people? And I think when that's the goal, when that's the true goal, that extends into every facet of the institution. It's no longer, this is a separate thing that is DEI. It's over here and we live here, but it's like, no, this is all encompassing. It's that, our favorite word, intersectional. It overlaps in everything that we do. And then I guess last, always put the dollar is king. So put your money where your mouth is, where this stuff is concerned. That's where you see in institutions real values, is how they're spending money. And if again, we're doing things to give lip service or appease an audience, but not spending money where real impact could be made, I think that's a sign. And I think for people like myself, I'll take a note from Julie of just do your research, get educated, and if you are the person who's educated, speak up in your spaces to educate others. I think that's all I have to say about that.
And if I could just piggyback off of Charles, just really, really quick, because when you mentioned dollar is king, and as an independent Black creative, I'm definitely focused on my dollars. And I think that part about, like, institutionally, when we know there's a pervasive wage gap, like based on gender and race, like, so even that is an easy thing. Like, how are you paying your BIPOC employees, right? Like, how hard do people have to work to get promotions or to even get raises? And so I think that sort of thing, it's easy to do the cute events, the nice events, the highly visible things. But what about that day in, day out about affirming the humanity and security of the people that work in these institutions? And so having worked in nonprofit, from nonprofit to corporate, and even as an independent teaching artist, I can see I see how so many D&I initiatives just kind of die and are busy work without ever really, coming from, hey, we have this thing that we're trying to do and we've done some events and some potlucks, to, okay, we're looking at pay equity, right? We're looking at, if you know the budget is $1,000, like, just tell me you have $1,000. Like, don't make me have to do research to figure out if I'm gonna get 175. Like, just being transparent, I think, in those ways, it makes a huge difference when we talk about putting our money where our mouth is and where we're spending money in the development of our employees, the advancement of the people we're coming in contact with. So I just wanted to explicitly say that.
Socioeconomic justice, always a time for that. So I want to encourage the members of our Stevens community to, again, use what the ancestors gave you wherever you are. Send some energy, intentional light, good vibes, gratitude to these two amazing human beings who have prioritized time. Thank you to both of you for going longer than we were scheduled. Thank you to our Stevens community as well, for those who could stay long. And for those who couldn't, we will definitely spread the word that this has been recorded and we will make it public. So it'll either be on the institution's DEI update web pages, or it'll be on the Office of DEI's page. But one of those two, we'll make sure to make it happen. And I also want to thank Rajay Henderson, who has hung in there and stayed in order to deliver our closing remarks. So again, Charles, Julia, thank you for your individual contributions. Thank you for the dyad of question and answer. We appreciate both of you. And it's my pleasure to introduce RahJai Henderson. She's going to close out the program. RahJai is a junior human development major from Kansas City, Missouri. She is in her second term of service as the president of Black Women Enlightened, otherwise known as BWE, on campus. Post-graduation, RahJai intends to spend a year working with children who navigate the world with cognitive disabilities. Then she's going to obtain a master's degree in family counseling, and then she's going to open her own practice. So please welcome RahJai Henderson.
Thank you, Shaashawn. So I wanted to share a poem that's one of my favorites from Langston Hughes. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I will be at the table when company comes. Nobody dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, then they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. I just wanted to say thank you to Miss Mallory for your insightful education to us as Stevens College, our women's college. Thank you for just being here and taking time out of your busy schedule to share your interesting thoughts to us, allowing us to be able to, just encouraging us to be more than what we are, do more research, to learn more for ourselves and not just from what people have taught us and what we've learned in our school systems. I want to say thank you to our harpist, Mr. Charles Overton, for just gracing us with your presence and just giving us that emotional ties to music. A lot of us, well, there's a lot of people on our campus that are musically inclined, and there's some that are not, me included, and that just made the afternoon. It was really amazing to hear you speak and to hear you play and just grace us with that. So yeah, I want to thank you guys for coming to our campus virtually and taking time out of your schedule for us.
Well done, Rajay. Thank you so much, and thank you for your leadership around campus. So we want to thank each and every one of you for prioritizing your time to attend the Stevens College 2021 Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. program. Thank you to Lita Pistono for all of the webinar and Zoom guru glue, as I tend to tell her. Thank you for all that you do to coordinate behind the scenes and connect. Thank you to Alicia Spare for setting the tone, for welcoming and the opening remarks that were fantastic. And of course, thank you for your service as the Assistant Director of the Student Success Center, where you are breaking down concepts of advising and tough science courses and making sure that it is empowering for those with different learning styles. So thank you. Thank you, Mariah Lindsay, for agreeing to share your awesome images. We're going to continue to work and find some walls on campus to print and definitely display those. So thank you. And thank you for talking us through your thoughts and your feelings around those images, because that's just as important as the output of your work. Thank you to Charles Overton for being, doing, playing, studying. And thank you to Julie and Mallory for critically thinking, for connecting, for challenging and posing questions to us. And thank you for your literary legacy. Blackmermaids.com. Just like you can go to charlesoverton.com and make sure that you support these Black creatives and their brands and the people that they are. And thank you, Rajay, again, for being a leader and for doing fantastic closing remarks. So we wish, I do want to encourage you that we will get in community again. We look forward to gathering on February 10th from 12:30 to 1:30. It'll be a Zoom facilitation by Jill McClintock. She is the Education and Training Coordinator with Services for Independent Living, known as the SIL. And she's going to do facilitation on person first language, on etiquette, and medical and social models of disability. So this is another opportunity for you to raise your awareness, right? Strengthen your emotional, your DEI, IQ, and then to have some call to actions on how you can make our campus, our classrooms, our departments more accessible for folks with physical, cognitive, linguistic, and behavioral disabilities. And then don't forget, of course, look in your email that we'll have Black History Month events, Women's History Month events in March, the DEI strategic planning sessions in March, and Asian Pacific Islander Month in May, just to name a few. So we wish you a creative, fantastic afternoon, evening, and remainder of a week. And thank you so much for joining us. And do your part to make more inclusive spaces everywhere you grace. Thank you all so much for being here. Peace.